And welcome to Weather Geeks. I'm Dr. Marshall Shepard from the University of Georgia, and I can't contain my excitement. My guest today, I've been a big fan of for many years. He's a songwriter, he's a musician, professor of the arts at Johns Hopkins University. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Dolby. You may remember his song, She Blinded Me with Science, but he has so much more awesome music. Let's talk a little bit about what you've been up to from your days as a pop music icon to a Silicon Valley executive to an academic. Tell us about that transition.
You know, at the end of the 80s, I got sort of disillusioned with the music industry, really. Yeah. You know, I was making my music on a computer, the same computer that my fans had, and then the internet came along, and I thought all I have to do is, you know, hit a button, but it didn't happen overnight, you know. It just seemed to take forever to happen. So I got more into the technology. And I was living in California, and I moved to Silicon Valley in the early 90s. I got fascinated by putting music on the internet, and I had a company, a startup company, and I became an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley for about 12 years. During that time, I was doing almost no music. I was the musical director of the TED conference when that really got going in California. But aside from that, I wasn't doing any of my own music, so my company, Beatnik, ended up putting the synthesizer in all of those Nokia cell phones. So that annoying little ringtone, that was us.
So you think about ringtones, and you might be wondering, well, why is Thomas Dolby on Weather Geeks? We're gonna get all into the science of his music. He has a really particular fascination with weather, climate, and environment. We're gonna get into all of that. And in fact, I want to kind of go there right now. In terms of weather, climate, the environment, how has that influenced your songwriting and your music?
It's a big deal for me. It's always been a big deal because I don't write those sort of relationship songs, you know, about text message breakups and all the rest of it. I've always been very strongly influenced by the environment that I'm in, by the atmosphere, by geography, and by the weather. And it's just been a fascination of mine since I was a kid. I went to one of those English boarding schools, all boys out in the country. You know.
Now, where did you grow up?
My father was an Oxford professor, and I grew up outside Oxford, and I went to a boarding school in the country. And my favorite pastime there was I was the meteorologist.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we had a little station at the top of the playing fields, and on those frosty mornings, I used to go out there and take the dew count and, you know, hot and cold temperatures, and I love that stuff. Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, and you know, I've listened to your music for some time, and many of your songs, I mean, you can see the influence of weather and climate, or what various things. Talk to us a little bit about some of your songs. I've got a list here of some of the songs. For example, Wind Power, Airwaves, Flying North, Weightless. Tell us a little bit about how those songs were inspired.
Yeah, I mean, I was really into renewable energy before that was even a thing.
Because this was like the mid-'80s?
Early 80s, yeah. 1980 I wrote Wind Power. Yeah. And I just had this dream of you know, because in the British Isles we got more wind potential than anywhere else in Europe. We've got like a third of the potential wind power in Europe. And I dreamed about, you know, wind farms out in the sea. And
in the early 80s.
In the early 80s. Now, guess what I see out of my window over there? I see, turbines.
Wow. What about Mulu, the Rainforest? I was listening to that coming in. That's off the Flat Earth album.
Yeah. That was the title of a book that I saw on the spine of a book, you know, like in a bookshop one day. And I just thumbed through it, and it was all about this indigenous culture in Indonesia who believed in Dreamtime, this sort of alternative reality. And the rainforest Mulu was at risk of being flooded by a dam that they were putting in. And a very noted BBC scientist called David Bellamy was out there protesting against the flooding of this rainforest, and that's why I wrote that song.
Now, I noticed that in my notes, the producers put in "I Love You Goodbye," which is off the Astronauts and Heretics album. It's probably my favorite song by you, and it's got a lot of weather imagery in there because it's talking about typhoons, and tell us a little bit about the inspiration for that song, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, so I have a really good friend who moved to New Orleans from Los Angeles, where I lived at the end of the 80s, and we went on a road trip in this beaten up Datsun out across the bayou. And I was really into Cajun music at the time, and it was just becoming possible to record remotely. So we stopped in the back of a little music store in like Crowley, Louisiana.
Oh, wow.
And every time I turned around, there was another musician was there with a squeeze box or a banjo or something, and I was recording them all to put them on my tracks. And in the end, I left him there and moved back to California. And so I Love You Goodbye was the sort of note to my friend. But I have to say, I got in a lot of trouble for that, because I tend to write lyrics that rhyme and that scan without really doing my research.
Sure.
And so there's stuff in there about the Everglades as well as the bayou.
Sure.
And people would write and complain to me, you know, the Everglades are actually in Florida.
Right? Yeah, I noticed
and
that.
I talk about the county sheriff who had a hair lip, and they're saying, we have parishes here, not
the county.
you know,
Yeah, no, I noticed that. But I mean, again, creative license.
Yeah.
Let's move to, I mean, there was a study done by streaming service Spotify that talked about that the type of weather can influence the type of music that people listen to. Do you buy that? And in turn, does the type of weather or the environment you're writing in influence you in some ways in terms of your mood or your perspective?
It's a huge influence on me. I think the first thing a songwriter does is they look out the window, you know, and so the weather's going to be reflected, and it does affect your mood in a very big way. And in the British Isles, more than most places, because 5 minutes go by and it's changed dramatically. Yeah. It's so random there, you know. There's no weather patterns really there. It's just complete chaos.
Well, I was going to ask you if there are any particular favorite weather types or patterns that you enjoy or like to write to, or just inspired by or interested in.
Well, I have to tell you about where I live in the UK, which is on the East Coast in a very remote village that has a population of 23. 23 people, no pub, no shops. It's very low lying. It's at threat from the rising sea levels. And there used to be a land bridge to Europe from England. You could walk to Holland thousands of years ago. But so we're shrinking, and the British Isles are tipping. So we're basically doomed.
Yes.
And so that's where my home is.
Oh, wow.
And my studio is in the garden of my home there. And there was no point in me building a lovely recording studio that would just get flooded. So I decided to build it on a boat, on a lifeboat. And I scanned eBay for months, and I finally found the perfect lifeboat. And I brought it to my garden in Suffolk, in England. And I took out the diesel engine and put in a bank of batteries and a turbine on the mast and solar panels on the roof. And I started making music.
And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that in the last break. But when we return, perhaps known for his song, She Blinded Me with Science, Thomas will tell us what he thinks of those who are actually blind to science. But first, our Geek of the Week.
This week's Geek of the Week is meteorologist Nick Walker, also known as the Singing Weather Dude. Yes, Nick serves on the council of the National Weather Association. He's a NOAA Weather Ready ambassador and has 2 recordings of children's weather songs. Nick also has 3 recordings of contemporary gospel music. Congratulations to Nick Walker, our Geek of the Week!
And we are talking with Thomas Dolby, pop icon, recording artist, Grammy nominated, and also we learned in the first segment a weather geek as well. We're going to bestow that term on you. And his book is called The Speed of Sound, Thomas Dolby, a memoir. Tell us a little bit about your book and what was the inspiration for this book.
So it's really the fact that, I grew up in London in the New Wave era. Yeah. So what was in the headlines was stuff like the Sex Pistols. Electronic music was very hard in the late 70s, early 80s. Big machines that didn't stay in tune, and they were expensive and bulky and very hard to record. And I was just always a DIY fanatic, so I would just find a way to solder these things together and make bleeps and blips with them and turn them into music somehow.
And we came into this block with She Blinded Me with Science, and obviously there was a clear scientific theme there, but you've really always, in all of your music and all of your songs, talked about technology and science. What really got you into science? Was it something as a kid, or just curiosity, or?
Well, I'm a bit of a bluffer, really, because, I didn't have a lot of sort of application at school, for science and math and those subjects. I was always into poetry, into art, into languages. But when I started making music, you have to understand this was an era of new wave when the pin-up stars were people like Adamant and Simon Le Bon and Sting, and I wasn't going to compete in the poster boy stakes. And so I thought, well, actually, I'm kind of a geek. I'm not sure if we had that term in those days.
We've embraced it here at Weather Geeks.
I was a boffin. They used to call me a boffin. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to be a cool scientist. So, I need a hot Japanese lab assistant and a cool vintage motorcycle And maybe I'll connect with some of these mad scientists from the BBC, people like Dr. Magnus Pike. This is the early days of MTV and music videos. So I started writing storyboards, for my videos. And I just sort of fell into this scientific image, and people picked up on it. It was, it was sort of a meme, of its day.
Right.
Because it was so different from other stuff that was out there. It was a catchy song, a catchy look, and it all caught on.
Right. Now, I know you've done quite a few things in your recording and also with your company and others. Is there one particular technology or innovation that you're most proud of as just an individual?
I don't really consider myself a pioneer, I was an explorer more than a pioneer. I just tended to work in areas that were undiscovered, because when you dive into an area like that, you have to be creative, because there's no rule book yet. So you can really express yourself in those areas. So whether it's electronic music, whether it's music videos, later music on the web, then cell phones, virtual reality, games, those kinds of things. I get most stimulation from working in an area where I don't really know what the heck I'm doing.
Right. Now, interesting, like the weather community, everyone has access to weather data and weather models now. The same thing with some of the recording and music technology, things like GarageBand on certain platforms and whatnot. What are your thoughts on this era of music, and what do you tell your students at Johns Hopkins?
I have mixed feelings about it. On a certain level, it's great that it's so accessible now. It's very rarefied when I started out, so you had to be a bit of a nutter, to go into it. But nowadays, everybody has got, apps on their phone for 99 cents that are capable of making music.
Right.
The bad news is, the moment you come up with something, there's 10,000 other guys somewhere in the world that have come up with the exact same combination.
Yeah, and
so it's harder and harder to seek out, a way to keep the rarity and the preciousness of the music.
And when we come back, this ship has a story to tell. We'll tell you the amazing story behind this lifeboat. You're not going to believe what's inside, next on Weather Geeks. And we're back on Weather Geeks talking with Thomas Dolby, and you wrote your 5th album, I believe it's called A Map of a Floating City in a Lifeboat.
Yeah.
Tell us about the lifeboat. You mentioned it earlier. It's called Nutmeg.
The Nutmeg of Consolation.
Okay.
Yeah. So my garden in East Anglia in England is very low-lying. If the ocean level rises a couple of meters, we're doomed.
You're doomed. Your home is, you mentioned that earlier. So you pay attention to climate change.
Absolutely, yeah. So I had this idea that, when the floods came, I would rise up like Noah and float off into the sunset making my music. So I found on eBay this lifeboat. There was a ship's lifeboat from the 1930s.
And we're seeing some pictures of it here.
Yeah. And I brought it to my garden, and I took out the diesel engine and put a wind turbine on the mast and solar panels on the roof and a bank of batteries under the floor. And so now I can work late into the night using nothing but renewable power. And while I'm working there, I'm staring out across the North Sea, and these massive container ships float around in the North Sea. And when the light is just right, they look just like floating cities.
Right.
The containers are stacked up. It looks like the Manhattan skyline. So I came up with this concept for a sort of alternative dystopian future when the only place that's cool enough to live is on the hulls of these abandoned ships heading towards the North Pole.
Wow.
And this became a concept to my album, A Map of the Floating City, and also a networked game.
Right.
And so all around the world, I had players playing this game. And
where can they get access to that now?
No, it's over.
Okay.
Unfortunately now, but thousands of people played it, and they would win the rights to download the songs from the album as they went along.
Now, so you mentioned that you do really pay attention and care about climate change. I want to get to something that's really interesting in contemporary times. The second album, or one of your albums, is called The Flat Earth. And there are a lot of people now that are flat earth societies and people talking about the earth is flat, but I get the sense that you wrote that song and that album from a different perspective than is obvious. Tell us about it.
It had a sense of irony to it.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't actually believe in the flat earth.
Sure.
The idea of the Flat Earth Society in 1983 or whenever it was, represented to me just sort of dreamers that hang on to outmoded concepts, out of a sense of romance and poetic license and so on. I saw a tweet the other day that was something along the lines of, members of the Flat Earth Society are all over the globe, I thought that was a pretty, that
The
was a pretty
irony
good
of
one.
that.
Yeah.
Now, but what do you think? Is that a classic example? These people that believe in the flat Earth, if you will, or that we never went to the moon, are they blinded by science or are they ignoring science? What are your thoughts?
I think they're blinded, really. I think there's a willful sustainment of disbelief, you know, in these ideas that are just, they're convenient, but, you know, as you know, it's inconvenient to face up to the truth.
Right.
And I think we've got to face up to it.
Right.
And we've got to do it rapidly because time is running out, you know.
Yeah. Are you mostly hopeful or pessimistic about, or do you believe science and technology will dig us out of some of the holes we're in?
I'd love to be optimistic. I can't be that optimistic. I can't, in my heart, I can't feel that optimistic about it. And I look at my kids and I just think we've messed things up so badly.
Right.
You know, but I mean, we've got to do what we can. And if there is hope, it's with the scientists, it's with the geeks, because heaven knows the politicians and the religious leaders aren't going to solve it.
Right. We try to kind of have conversation with all of those folks here on Weather Geeks. In 30 seconds or less, what's next for Thomas Dolby?
You know, after everything that I've done through my career, I sort of feel that the best thing I can do now is try and pass it on, try and pass on some of the experience and hopefully the wisdom to a new generation of kids. So I'm teaching a degree course at Johns Hopkins University, and we're focused on the next wave, which is really virtual reality, augmented reality, all sorts of immersive worlds, and how can sound and music play a part in that.
And I'm hearing the music, which means it's time for us to end. Thank you for joining us on
Thanks,
Weather
Marshall.
Geeks. Remember, we're here every Sunday, and we're also on Twitter at WX Geeks, TWC, and you can find us on Facebook. See you next week on Weather Geeks. Thank you very much.